of rather large features made him an ideal type for the screen at any angle, in close-ups and foregrounds as well as full shots. In actual life there were little things covered by makeup in his work, such as the cold gray tint of his eyes and the lines of dissipation about his mouth. Kennedy questioned him first about his movements in the different scenes, then asked him if he had seen or noticed anything suspicious during the taking of any of them, or in the intervals between. "I had several changes, Mr. Kennedy," he replied. "Part of the time I was Jack Daring, my regular role, but I was also the emissary who looked like Daring. I went out each time because I make up the emissary to look hard. Warner wanted to fool the people a little bit, but he didn't want them to be positive the emissary was Daring, as would happen if both make-ups were the same." "Did you have any opportunity to talk to Miss Lamar?" "None at all. Warner was pushing us to the limit." "Did she seem her usual self at the start of the scene?" "No. She seemed a little out of sorts. But—" Gordon hesitated. "Something had been troubling her all day. She hardly would talk to me in the car on the way out at all. It didn't strike me that she acted any different when she went in to take the scene." "You were engaged to her?" "Yes." Gordon's eyes caught the body of the davenport before him. He glanced away hastily, taking his lower lip between his teeth. "Had you been having any trouble?" "No. That is, nothing to amount to anything." "But you had a quarrel or a misunderstanding?" His face flushed slowly. "She was to obtain her final decree early next week. I wanted her to marry me then at once. She refused. When I reproached her for not considering my wishes, she pretended to be cool and began an elaborate flirtation with Merle Shirley." "You say she only pretended to be cool?" For a few moments Gordon hesitated. Then apparently his vanity loosened his tongue. He wished it to be understood that he had held the love of Stella to the last. "Last night," he volunteered, "we made everything up, and she was as affectionate as she ever had been. This morning she was cool, but I could tell it was pretense, and so I let her alone." "There's been no real trouble between you?" The leading man met Kennedy's gaze squarely. "Not a bit." Kennedy turned to McKay. "Mr. Shirley," he ordered. By a miscalculation on the part of the little district attorney, the heavy man entered the room a moment before Gordon left. They came face to face just within the portieres. There was no mistaking the hostility, the open hate between the two men. Both Kennedy and I caught the glances. Then Merle Shirley approached the fireplace, taking the chair indicated by Kennedy. "I wasn't in any of the opening scenes," he explained. "I remained out in the car until I got wind of the excitement. By that time Stella was dead." "Do you know anything of a quarrel between Miss Lamar and Gordon?" Shirley rose, clenching his fists. For several moments he stood gazing down at the star with an expression on his face which I could not analyze. The pause gave me an opportunity to study him, however, and I noticed that while he had heavier features than Gordon and was a larger man in every way, ideally endowed for heavy parts, there was yet a certain boyish freshness clinging to him in subtle fashion. He wore his clothes in a loose sort of way which suggested the West and the open, in contrast to Gordon's metropolitan sophistication and immaculate tailoring. He was every inch the man, and a splendid actor, I knew. Yet there was the touch of youth about him. He seemed incapable of a crime such as this unless it was in anger, or as the result of some deep-running hidden passion. Now, whether he was angry or in the clutch of a broad disgust, I could not tell. Perhaps it was both. Very suddenly he wheeled upon Kennedy. His voice became low and vibrant with feeling. Here was none of the steeled self-control of Manton, the deceptive outer mask which Warner used to cover his thoughts, the nonchalant, cold frankness of Gordon. "Mr. Kennedy," the actor exclaimed, "I've been a fool. A fool." "How do you mean?" "I mean that I allowed Stella to flatter my vanity and lead me into a flirtation which meant nothing at all to her. God!" "You are responsible for the trouble between Miss Lamar and Gordon, then?" "Never!" Shirley indicated the body of the star with a quick, passionate sweep of his hand. Now I could not tell whether he was acting or in earnest. "She's responsible!" he exclaimed. "She's responsible for everything." "Her death—" "No." Shirley sobered suddenly, as if he had forgotten the mystery altogether. "I don't know anything at all about that, nor have I any idea unless—" But he checked himself rather than voice an empty suspicion. "Just what do you mean, then?" Kennedy was sharp, impatient. "She made a fool of me, and I was engaged to Marilyn Loring—" "Were engaged? The engagement—" "Marilyn broke it off last night and wouldn't listen to me, even though I came to my senses and saw what a fool I had been." "Was—" Kennedy framed his question carefully. "Was your infatuation for Miss Lamar of long duration?" "Just a few weeks. I took her out to dinner and to the theater and that was all." "I see." Kennedy walked away, nodding to McKay. "Will you have Miss Loring next?" asked the district attorney. Kennedy nodded. "Marilyn Loring was a surprise to me. Stella Lamar both on the screen and in real life was a beauty. In the films Marilyn was a beauty also, apparently of a cold, unfeeling type, but in the flesh she was disclosed as a person utterly different from all my preconceived notions. In the first place, she was not particularly attractive except when she smiled. Her coloring, hair frankly and naturally red, skin slightly mottled and pale, produced in photography the black hair and marble, white skin which distinguished her. But as I studied her, as she was now, before she had put on any make-up, and while she was still dressed in a simple summer gown of organdie, she looked as though she might have stepped into the room from the main street of some Midwestern town. In repose she was shy, diffident in appearance. When she smiled, naturally, without holding the hard lines of her vampire rolls, there was the slight suggestion of a dimple, and she was essentially girlish. When a trace of emotion or feeling came into her face, the woman was evident. She might have been 17 or 37. To my surprise, Kennedy made no effort to elicit further information concerning the personal animosities of these people. Perhaps he felt it too much of an emotional maze to be straightened out in this preliminary investigation. When he found Marilyn had watched the taking of the scenes, he compared her account with those which he had already obtained. Then he dismissed her. In rapid succession, for he was impatient now to follow up other methods of investigation, he called in and examined the remaining possible witnesses of the tragedy. These were the two extra players, the butler and the maid, the assistant director, Phelps's house servants, and Emory Phelps himself. For some unknown reason he left the owner of the house to the very last. "Why did you wish these scenes photographed out here?" he asked. "Because I wanted to see my library in pictures." "Were you watching the taking of the scenes?" "Yes." "Will you describe just what happened?" Phelps flushed. He was irritated and in no mood to humor us any more than necessary. A man of perhaps 40, with the portly flabbiness which often accompanies success in the financial markets, he was accustomed to obtaining rather than yielding obedience. A bachelor, he had built this house as a show place merely, according to the gossip among newspaper men, seldom living in it. "Haven't about a dozen people described it for you already?" he asked, distinctly petulant. Kennedy smiled.